I had just pulled into a truck stop inside Billings, Montana. I was playing slots and a beautiful Native American girl was serving drinks. After quite a few drinks, I started chatting with her on a more personal level. She told me that her shift ended in a few hours and that she would be behind the truck stop with a case of beer if I felt like partying. I hung around the front of the building, and when everyone started filing out of the doors, I went around back to meet her. I couldn't find her, but I found an older woman who seemed to know my name and acted as if I had just been talking to her inside. I was buzzed, but not drunk or stupid. I knew this wasn't the same person. What also struck me as odd is that she had no personal belongings besides the clothes on her back. I started to feel a little tripped out because of this, began to act like I didn't know her and didn't want anything to do with her. She became cold and stopped trying to talk to me. I walk all the way back out to my truck, climb in the back, change into my sleepwear and laid on the bunk to reread a book. Only a few minutes into the book, I hear 3 loud bangs on the side of my sleeper. I opened the curtains and rolled down the window and saw that the young Native American woman I had been speaking with was standing next to my truck. I immediately picked up something wrong about her. It wasn't her lack of speech, odd, disheveled look, or rigid body movements. It was her eyes that got to me. Solid black. I could say that the dark night coupled with a few drinks could make me think her eyes were black, but I'm not. When I hit a switch in the back of my truck, the inside lights up like a baseball stadium. Her eyes seemed to be pulling the light into them, like miniature black holes. It looked like she had rubbed charcoal around her eyes. It also felt like my body was acting of its own accord, like my body was screaming at my fragile psyche to open the door and let her into my truck, despite the fact that she looked freaking terrifying and hadn't said a single word to me since meeting her again. I remember having to choke out the word no. It reminded me of when you're on the verge of tears, but you choke through them to speak to someone. I was too terrified to look out my side vents to see if she was still standing outside. I was too terrified that I might have ended up looking back into darkness, only to know, in my mind's eye, that she could be staring right back at me. My uncle was a truck driver for many years. He spent several years doing cross-country trips, often loading up his trailer in the middle of the night. While he waited for his trailer to be loaded, he'd make his way over to a nearby truck stop, have a late-night meal, etc. After a while, he would make friends with drivers that were on a somewhat similar schedule. He befriended this particular guy that he would run into about once a month or so. One night the guy invites him back to his semi. He wants to show him something he's built. This guy's semi has a sleeper on the back, so it's pretty big. Basically, it's a semi-truck with a small room right behind the driver to sleep in. My uncle is intrigued by what kind of custom work this guy has done, so he goes along with him. Once they're in the truck, the guy shows him what he's built in the sleeper of his semi. It's a big, heavy-duty box. Apparently, it has hydraulic arms on either side so he can open and close it with the push of a button. He says, once he pushes the button it seals shut, it can't be opened. My uncle is kind of weirded out by this and cracks a few jokes about the box. The guy starts to get a little agitated. My uncle realizes this and decides it's time to leave this guy's semi. A few months later he finds out that the guy was a serial killer stuffing truck stop hookers and others into this custom hydraulic box. At this point in the story, his hand starts shaking and he can barely drink his beer. That guy was massive, he says. His hand could cover most of my head. He could have stuffed me in the box and there's nothing I could have done to stop him. Or maybe, there was someone in there already. Was driving north through the mountains of Colorado towards Pueblo, and it was my first time dealing with anything like the Rocky Mountains, so I was taking it nice and slow with my hazards on and in the right lane. This was in the spring, and there wasn't much snow on the ground aside from a light dusting. I remember passing another truck pulled to the shoulder on my way up, nothing out of the ordinary. However, as I was heading down the mountain, which can be scary in an 18-wheeler, I saw the same truck I passed earlier fly by me in the left-hand lane. Now being passed on the left going downhill in the Rocky Mountains by another tractor-trailer is crazy enough, but what really makes this story is this guy's trailer brakes were on fire. He was pulling the load, and if you know anything about trucks, you know there's only so much braking you're supposed to do before they overheat and, worst case, catch fire. This guy's truck looked like a comet as he sped down the mountain at what I thought was a surely to be deadly pace. I grabbed the mic to the radio and called out to him, "Hey! Your brakes are on fire. I mean literally on fire." After a few seconds of static, a rough and weathered sounding voice comes back over the speaker of my radio and says, "I know." And he disappeared around a curve. I never saw any wrecked truck, emergency crews, or even mention of an accident over the radio. I did see a discarded fire extinguisher on the ground at the base of the mountain though. My dad drove a truck between Edinburgh and London. One day, he was driving down the motorway and looked to his right, saw a woman staring at him with a terrified expression from a car next to him. Before he really knows how to react, the car pulls off at the next exit and my dad, although shaken, carries on. About half an hour later, a different car with a different driver pulls alongside my dad, with the same woman in the passenger seat, with the same expression on her face. My dad thinks to pull into the next services to report, as even if it's nothing, better to be safe than sorry. Anyway, the car disappears before he can get any details, and he thinks there's no point calling the police with no details, so he carries on driving. Literally about 4 hours later, almost in London, yet another car pulls alongside him with the same woman, same terrified expression, except this time she appears to be screaming at my dad through the window, so my dad pulls over and calls the police. Apparently, they have received 3 other calls about the same woman in the same area in the last few minutes. It is unfortunately anticlimactic as he never heard anything more about it, but he didn't see her again, and although he kept an eye on the news, didn't see anything about it. Around 2006, I was driving flatbed, picked up a load of construction material in rural Tennessee. I strapped everything down, tarped the load and left the shipper. About 5 miles down the road, in the middle of nowhere, on a 2-lane road, I noticed my tarp flapping in the wind. Found a wide shoulder and pulled over to fix it. I realized that I just did a shitty job tarping this load and decided to redo it on the side of the road. Suddenly, I see a guy walking down the same side of the road I'm on, coming towards my truck. I don't think anything about it other than to keep an eye on him, 'cause I'm in the middle of nowhere. About the time I have tarps set in place and am climbing down, this dude is getting close enough that I'm now paying more attention to him than I am to tarping my load. I grab my winch bar and set it on the trailer where I'm working just in case. The guy gets to me and the first thing I notice is his hair. It's like a mullet, but it's patchy. The next thing I notice were his eyes, which I can only describe as off. Like they were clear. I didn't think he was drunk or high or anything, but it also gave me the distinct impression that the elevator didn't go all the way up. Clothes were dirty and not well maintained, with dirty white tennis shoes, 'cause I remember he didn't have laces on one shoe and the tongue was noticeably out of place. He stops by me, waits until I acknowledge him and just says, "I've got a long walk." I'm like, "Yeah man, you do, we're in the middle of nowhere." Making it clear there's no ride to be had here. He nods, starts walking by me, continuing on his way, stops at about the driver door on my truck and turns around, comes back to me and repeats himself. "I've got a long walk." At this point I explain that I can't give him a ride, insurance and all that. Apologize for not being able to help him out, and he seems to accept this, turns around and leaves. I wait for him to get a little away from my truck and start working on finishing the tarp job. I still keep an eye on him and he's moving away from me. As I'm putting on the last of the bungee straps, I look over to check where he's at, and he's turned around heading back towards me, now about 100 yards in front of my truck and coming back my way. It looks like he's talking on a cell phone, has his hand up to his face and I can barely make out his mouth moving, his other hand waving like he's having a conversation with someone. I finish with the straps, grab my winch bar, and am climbing into my truck as he's about 10 yards away now. Soon as I'm in the cab, I lock the doors, and set the winch bar on the passenger seat just in case. I look at the guy and realize he's not talking on a phone, he's talking to his hand, and now I'm nervous, cause he doesn't look like he's having a nice pleasant chat, it looks more like an angry conversation. Crank the truck up, put it in gear and just pull out, didn't look for traffic or anything. As I pass him, he's just looking at me, still holding his hand to his face with this dead look on his face, just staring at me. About the time I hit 5th or 6th gear, I look in the mirror and there's no one there. If you enjoyed your time here, please consider leaving a like on this video and subscribe to FearLore. And don't forget to share your thoughts on the comments section below. Thank you for watching.